So you're thinking about hosting Drupal on AWS. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Just spin up a server and you're good to go. Well, what if I told you that the way most people do it isn't just a little off, it's fundamentally broken? In this explainer, we're going to dig into why, and more importantly, how to actually get it right.
So, when you think Drupal on AWS, what pops into your head? Is it just, a single EC2 box running a LAMP stack? If that's the image you have, I've got some not so great news. That super simple picture, it's pretty much a recipe for disaster.
Because the reality is, a real production-grade Drupal site isn't just one thing. It's a whole ecosystem. You need way more than just a server for PHP. You've got to have a managed database like RDS, shared storage for all your files, think EFS or S3, and multiple layers of caching just to keep things fast. And that's all before we even start talking about the really critical stuff like backups, monitoring, security, and having a deployment workflow that doesn't rely on hope and prayer.
Okay, so when teams try to build all this out themselves, they almost always fall into one of three traps. We'll call them the common failure paths. And as we go through them, see if any of this sounds a little too familiar.
All right, first up, we have Path A, the classic single EC2 box. This is like the hello world of cloud hosting. And look, I get why people do it. It seems simple, it looks cheap when you're just starting, but that simplicity is a total illusion. When you put everything, your database, your files, your code, all on one little machine, you're creating a massive single point of failure. It completely goes against what AWS considers best practice for a reason.
So what's the big deal? Well, when that single server goes down, and trust me, it will go down, your site isn't just slow, it's gone, poof, completely offline. And getting new code up there, it's usually some manual, nail-biting process of copying files and just hoping for the best. Not exactly a great strategy.
Okay, so Path B is a step up. Maybe. This is where you use a generic platform as a service. It's something like Elastic Beanstalk. And it's nice because it hides some of the messy infrastructure stuff and gives you basic auto-scaling. But here is the catch. These platforms weren't built for Drupal. They have no idea what Drush is. They don't understand Drupal's config management system. They're just generic.
And what happens when you use a generic tool for a specific job? Well, as your site gets more complex, you just start bolting on other AWS services without any real plan. Pretty soon, you've got this tangled mess of stuff, and simple things like rolling back a bad deployment or spinning up a quick test environment become these complicated manual hacks. It's a nightmare to manage.
And that leads us to Path C, the most ambitious and maybe the most dangerous one, the half-finished Kubernetes cluster. Look, the promise of containers is amazing, right? Self-healing, easy scaling, but the reality for most teams is that you're now trying to manage two insanely complex systems at the same time, AWS and Kubernetes. This creates what the experts call a dual control plane nightmare, where you're constantly fighting with conflicting security rules and network policy.
And here's where it gets really scary. Most teams never actually finish the job. They get Drupal running in a container, high five, and move on. But they never properly wire up the security, the monitoring, or the automated GitOps workflows. So they're left with a system that's insecure by default, and that only one or two people in the company, the tribal knowledge experts, actually know how to operate.
Okay, so if those are all the ways to get it wrong, what does getting it right actually look like? Let's pull up the official production-ready checklist. This is what AWS actually expects for any serious website running on their platform.
First up, let's talk about the absolute fundamentals. You need reproducible environments. That means your dev, test, and production environments have to be perfect clones of each other. You need fully automated deployments that come straight from Git with a safe way to roll back if something goes wrong. And please, you have to have a centralized way to manage secrets. No database passwords in your code, ever. Plus a solid, thought-out strategy for your database and your file storage.
And speaking of that, I want to share a line that comes straight from AWS. It's so important. Backups without validated restores are not a DR plan. Think about that for a second. If you're just taking backups, but you've never actually tried to restore from them, you don't really have a plan. You've just got a vague hope.
Next up is all the stuff you need to do day in and day out. We're talking multiple layers of caching. Inside Drupal, reverse proxies, a CDN, you need full observability. That means logs, metrics, and traces so you can actually see what your application is doing. And of course, relentless security hardening, active cost controls, a disaster recovery plan you've actually tested, and all the compliance controls you need to meet.
Okay, take a breath. Feeling a little overwhelmed by that list? Yeah, that's a totally normal reaction. How is any team, especially if you're not a giant enterprise with a huge budget, supposed to build and manage all of this correctly? It's a massive ask.
Well, the answer is that most teams can't do it all from scratch because they're usually missing one absolutely critical piece of the puzzle. There's a layer that sits between just using a bunch of AWS services and actually using AWS the right way. And that missing piece is what we call an orchestration layer.
So what the heck is an application orchestration layer? Put simply, it's a smart system that sits on top of AWS and basically automates the entire lifecycle of your application. Everything from provisioning the infrastructure to deploying your code to handling security and day-to-day operations. And it does it all based on proven best practices, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time.
So, how does this actually fix all those problems we talked about? Well, an orchestration layer automates the creation of those identical environments we need. It standardizes your entire deployment process, enforcing things like GitOps and safe rollbacks. It builds security and compliance in from the ground up. They're not an afterthought. And it handles the really hard stuff: scaling, cost control, monitoring, systematically. It's the difference between needing a massive DevOps team just to keep the lights on and actually empowering your developers to work safely and efficiently.
All right, so this brings us to the real gut check moment. The question you need to be asking yourself and your team. Are you really doing it right? Let's apply this directly to your setup right now.
You know, the source material we're using for this explainer puts it pretty bluntly. It says, and I'm basically quoting here, if you are hosting Drupal on AWS and not using DevPanel, it is very likely that you are missing critical pieces. Essentially, it argues that for an application as specific as Drupal, a specialized orchestration platform like DevPanel is the thing that fills in all those gaps in that best practice checklist.
Okay, so let's run a quick test. 5 questions. Be honest with yourself. Question 1. Can you, right now, create a brand new, fully functional environment? Database, code, files, everything? From scratch with a single automated command. No clicking around in the AWS console.
Question 2. Are all of your environments, from a developer's laptop to staging to production, using the exact same infrastructure as code, the same security rules, and the same deployment pipeline? Is there literally zero drift between them? Question 3, and this one's huge for security. Are all of your secrets, your database passwords, your API keys, stored in a secure, managed system like AWS Secrets Manager? And are you 100% positive they are not in your code or in a config file somewhere in a Git repo?
Question 4. Can you prove right now that you can do a successful restore of your production database and files into a fresh environment? And can you do it within the recovery time your business demands? More importantly, when was the last time you actually tested it?
And finally, question 5. Do you have one single dashboard where you can see all the logs, performance metrics, and application traces for every single one of your environments, with alerts that actually tell you when something is wrong before your users do?
So how'd you do on that little quiz? If you answered no to 3 or more of those questions, then your current setup is carrying some serious risk. And it's probably time to seriously reconsider your approach before the next major incident forces you to. Because let's be real, the cost of setting things up the right way is nothing compared to the cost of a catastrophic outage.